Probably everyone has heard of the United Nations, a global organization representing almost all the states of the world. The UN, of course, receives quite some coverage in media, but it is also heavily researched by scholars. What I would like to do in this short video is to tell you about the results of research we have conducted over last years with a colleague of mine, Matthew Stephen. I will not talk about state and high politics in the UN. Instead, our research focuses on those who actually work for the United Nations bodies as such. The UN administration, or as we call them, the staff of the United Nations body secretariats. Who are these people and where do they come from? There are several dozen thousand people employed by the bodies of the United Nations system, working in around 1,500 duty stations literally all over the world. They can be either so-called professional staff or the so-called general services, support staff. Now, in our research, we focus on the international professional staff, so those who are hired as professionals, as experts, to serve in different locations across the world. As shown by our data, in the mid-2010s, there were around 34,000 such professional staff members in the UN in total. What we are most interested in is which countries these people come from. In other words, how representative is the international administration of the nations of the world. Now, just to be clear, the people who work for the UN are not supposed to really represent their countries. They are there to work for the UN and they are supposed to be loyal to the mission of the United Nations. In fact, the Charter of the United Nations prohibits them from taking any instructions from the state. In reality though, having own nationals working for the UN administration can provide states with important advantages. For example, at the very least, it may serve them as an additional informal channel of information about what is happening inside the UN bodies. That may be, of course, very valuable. Okay, so which countries are represented most? The United States are at the top of the ranking, with around 10% of all the professional staff working for the UN. They are followed by several European countries, France with 6%, Britain with 5%, Italy, Germany, and so on. Now, the first developing country, ranking 7, is India, with 3% of all the UN staff. Approximately half of all the professional staff working in the United Nations comes from the so-called OECD countries, the group of most economically advanced states. When we look at the evidence in a longer-term perspective, over the last 20 years, we see some interesting changes. The representation of the richest countries in the world, while still very high, is in relative decline. So countries like, for instance, Denmark, the Netherlands, USA, France, and others are slowly losing their share. A major loss of the share on UN staff has been suffered also by Russia. In contrast, a number of developing countries have significantly increased their presence in the UN. This includes India, I mentioned earlier, but also a large number of sub-Saharan African countries. Again, the trend is not that fast, but it is clearly present. Now, interestingly enough, China has so far not improved its position in the UN administration at all. Yet, overall, slowly but surely, we see a reshuffling of the UN body staff towards a relatively more equitable representation of the countries of the world. Interesting, isn't it? Nevertheless, it seems from our evidence that these rebalancing trends towards a more equitable representation of countries are only present in the most highly visible, largest organizations, such as the United Nations Secretariat, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and so on. In the less visible, often smaller technical organizations, we do not see much of a change. Now, this nice figure shows that. The flat dashed line here shows the share of the richest OECD countries on the staff of the less visible UN bodies over the last 20 years. Nothing happening there really. The OECD world keeps its position. In contrast, in the highly visible bodies, marked with the downward sloping full line, the dominance of the OECD countries has been diminishing. Over the years 1996 to 2015, the share of the OECD countries has decreased from around 60% to just a little more than 50% on average across the highly visible UN bodies. Perhaps the larger, more visible bodies find themselves under more pressure to increase the representation of the less advanced countries. Pressures from NGOs, media and general public, and also the member states themselves. The less visible bodies, which few people know actually exist, do not face such pressures and continue their work as they used to. Okay, so these are our findings. We have mapped how each country is represented through its citizens in the United Nations system. And while the richest countries are still dominant, the composition of the administrative bodies of the UN is changing. They are becoming more representative of the countries of the world.